All right. Hey, everyone. My name is Indira. I'm really excited to introduce our speaker for the session. But before we do that, I just wanted to let everyone know that if you have any questions for her, please post it in the chat section on the right-hand side of your screen. I will be monitoring that throughout the session and will make sure your questions get answered. So our speaker, Shayna Cummings, is a software engineer and tech lead at Pluralsight, an online tech skills platform. She also serves as a director for Women Who Code in Boston and teaches software development in a variety of Boston area organizations and nonprofits. Prior to Pluralsight, Shayna worked in engineering and project management roles at Maxwell Health and Harvard University. She holds a BA in linguistics and psychology from McGill University in Montreal, Canada. Shayna is also passionate about education, healthcare, community building, and making tech more accessible to everyone. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce my friend Shayna. Thank you.
So much, Indira. Indira is one of my co-directors at Women Who Code Boston, so thank you so much for being here today. All right, can everyone see my screen okay? Great. Well, welcome everyone. I'm super excited to be here. As Indira mentioned, today we're going to be talking about crafting your engineering career story. So this is a 90-minute workshop, but it's divided into 2 parts, so you can attend one or both parts. It will be recorded along with all of the other sessions at the conference today. The first part is about 55 minutes. So this is writing your career story. So this is actually taking you through the process of thinking through your personal narrative, how to structure your job search, and writing out your resume. And the second part is telling your story. So this is the behavioral interview and taking all of the stuff that we did in the first part and using it in your interview. So as Indira mentioned, my name is Shayna Cummings. I'm a software engineer and tech lead. I had a little bit of a non-traditional start to software engineering. So my background was in the social sciences, and I attended a boot camp about 6 years ago, and I've been a full stack engineer ever since. So I Boston, Massachusetts, where I'm coming from today. And I'm very involved with Women Who Code. It's been a really wonderful part of my career journey. So I do have a little bit of a non-traditional path to tech, but I've been really fortunate to talk with a lot of other folks, engineers and otherwise, about their path to tech. And so I'm excited to bring those stories into the conversation today. I want to start with a little bit of a disclaimer. So before we start, I just want to let you know that this presentation contains many of my own personal opinions. So your experience may vary, but I do want to let you know that I have done a good amount of research about these topics, and I've talked to a lot of people. I also want to let you know that this presentation is going over the process of applying to developer jobs, specifically in US companies. So if you are applying to a company outside of the US, the process might be a little bit different. So I really encourage you to research and read up on the different processes of the countries where you're applying. So throughout the talk, I'm going to be pausing for questions. Indira is kindly and Mackenzie are both helping moderate the chat. So please put them in the chat as you go, and I will pause at different moments and kind of answer them as much as I can. The talk's being recorded, and so let's get started. So first of all, we're going to be digging into why you're here. Why are you looking for a job right now? Let's get a little existential about what drives you in your work. Then we're going to be talking about doing some pre-work. So this is the work that you need to do to frame your search and make sure that you're approaching it with the right mindset. And then the last part is the meatiest part, which is to actually write it down. So writing your actual resume. And again, so this is part 1. This will be 55 minutes. And then around 1:25 Eastern, we'll switch over to the interview process. So first of all, I'd like to encourage you to get a little existential. When you're searching for a job, it's really easy to get caught up in the mechanics of the search. You're applying to a bunch of different things. There's a million emails. You might be cold emailing people or just trying to connect with people. And this is also a really strange time right now. We're in the middle of a global pandemic. Tens of millions of people in the United States are out of work, and in many other countries as well. And then the United States, we're in the middle of a long overdue public reckoning about systemic racism and injustice in our country. So the interview process and the application process is already really stressful, and there's a lot of other factors that are going to contribute to additional stress in this process. So I want to encourage you to give yourself some compassion, make sure that you give yourself some time for self-care, and realize that this is already a really hard process, and it's being compounded by a lot of other things going on in the world. So I want to encourage you to focus on your why. Why are you here? How are you going to approach the job application process? Maybe you're in a role that's not really working for you and you're kind of like thinking about moving on. Maybe you just got laid off. Maybe you just graduated or you just came out of a boot camp. Or maybe you're taking you took some time off and you're coming back to work after a long time. There's so many different reasons why you could be looking for a job right now. And so just try to reflect a little bit about why you're here today. So let's talk about how to construct your personal narrative. You hear a lot about this word narrative. What does this mean? So this is basically your unique story, your personal history that makes you especially you. And here are some questions that you can ask yourself to help craft your personal narrative. First of all, what experiences brought you here to this place and time? Personal and professional experiences that have contributed to where you are today. What are you most proud of? What are the things that make your heart swell when you think about them, your accomplishments, your strengths? What makes you different? What gives you energy? What makes you the superstar on your team? You have unique qualities that you bring to every experience and every interaction. What are those things? What gives you energy? What makes you excited to wake up in the morning? What are the things that make, the more that you do them, you lose track of time? And conversely, what are aspects of previous jobs that you did not enjoy? What things drain you of energy? What things do you not want to do going forward? And also, I invite you to envision, what does your life look like in 2 years from now, 5 years, 10 years? It's a really hard question, right? Especially right now, there's a lot of uncertainty, but it's a really good activity to kind of set aside the day-to-day concerns. What does your life look like? And then this is my favorite one. If you could be paid $1 million per year to do any job, what would it be? In tech or not in tech? So as you consider these questions, I invite you to look for themes or patterns in your responses. These are really, really key attributes to your personal narrative. So you might see themes that, like, you really enjoy helping with people, you really enjoy contributing to a very complicated problem, you enjoy strategic analysis. There are so many different themes that might start to arise as you consider these questions. I love this quote. I think it's been attributed to Sheryl Sandberg, but it is, your career is not a ladder, it is a jungle gym. And I think one of the things when we're looking for a job or we're thinking about our career, we tend to think really linearly. So we think, like, how do I get to the top? Every job has to, perfectly be the next step up from the job that we currently have. But for the majority of people, that's actually not true. So your trajectory does not have to be perfect. You might bounce around to a lot of different things in a lot of different industries, and that is totally okay. The majority of people do that. And so just embrace change and embrace opportunities wherever you can find them. All right, this is the part where we get a little tactical. We want to take the narrative that we just started to write and start feeding it into your job search work. As you start looking at roles or thinking about companies, I want you to visualize your ideal. And I want you to start writing down some things that you would see as ideal. First of all, what is your day-to-day work doing? What are you actually spending your time doing in this job? Are you working on the front end? Are you working on the back end? Are you doing pair programming? Are you building microservices? Are you fixing legacy systems? Are you interacting with customers? Are you doing data science analysis? Are you writing tests? Like, there's so many different things that you can actually do as an engineer. So think about the tasks that you want to do. Also consider the type of company that you want to work for. So do you want to work at a product company on a SaaS product? Do you want to work at an agency? Do you want to build websites for people? Are you interested in working at a little tiny startup or a big multinational company? These are all really important things for you to identify where you think you might thrive. Also, what industry do you want to work in? Does it matter? Maybe you feel really passionate about a particular industry or a particular problem, and maybe you want to try to focus your search in that space. Also consider the stability of the company that you work at versus the potential for growth. So if you work at a big multinational company, things might move a little bit more slower, but it might be a little bit more stable than a little tiny scrappy startup. And finally, your work-life balance. This is a really important question. Depending on where you're at in your personal life, you might be able to tolerate doing more work or less work. How many hours per week do you expect to work? Do you want to be on call? There's so many different things that you need to think about when it comes to your work and how it balances with the rest of the things that are not your work. And finally, what are the salary and benefits that you need to live your life? At the end of the day, you're getting a job because you need money, right? You need to be able to provide for yourself and your loved ones. And you need to think really carefully about your budget, what you're spending, and what kind of life you want to have. So it's not also just salary. You also want to think about what is your vacation time? What kind of healthcare coverage do you need? What about educational stipends or other leadership development opportunities? You want to think about all of these things in an ideal state and then figure out how the companies you're looking at map to them or not. Regina has in the chat, it's also important to be aligned with the mission and the values of the company. That's a really great point. I think the culture of the company is really, really important. And finally, there is the do not want list. This is a really important list to create for yourself. You might feel a little entitled when you're making it, but it's really important to make it. So these are the things that you do not want under any circumstances. So if you had a bad experience with a particular type of role or activity at your last job, you want to write that down. These are things that no matter how much they pay you, you don't want to do. As you consider the different attributes of companies, it might be really helpful to create something like this. This is a weighted matrix that you could use to rate different qualifications of the companies you're looking at as you're searching for jobs. So you can see on the left-hand side, there's a list of attributes. So things like work-life balance, having a diverse team, having a learning-centric culture, or having a stable business model. These different attributes, you can weight them according to your needs at this time. And then you can rate your current company and then any other companies you're looking at on these different attributes. Again, it's not a perfectly scientific method, but it's a really great way, and it's helped me personally in my job search as I think about what's important to me. My #1 job search tip is to connect with other humans at the companies you're applying for. So obviously, this is a little bit harder during COVID time, but there's lots of ways that you can connect with other people. So ideally, you'd be doing them in real life, but you can do most of these things online. You can do things like attend tech meetups, Women Who Code, for example. You can attend career fairs where you can connect with actual engineers from the team, recruiters, and other people. Conferences, just like this one, are a great way to connect with people from the companies you're interested in. And also volunteering. If you're interested in doing any kind of tech volunteering, working in schools or charitable organizations, that can be a great way to connect with people. ABN is an expression I've seen, hashtag ABN, always be networking. You never know when you might meet someone that has a potential job connection for you. So even if you meet someone in a taxi or an Uber, you might end up being able to make a connection. There's a question in the chat. Do you find that your linguistics BA helped you in learning programming language? If so, can you describe how? That's a really great question. So it's really interesting. When I studied linguistics, I did not study computer science at all. It was largely theoretical. But I think it is really interesting because there's a ton of connections between language and computer programming languages. One of the things that linguistics really helped me do was think about systems and think about how to break down problems in a really good way. I would say, I think it has helped me indirectly and not intentionally, but it's been great. All right. Here are some other ways that you can connect with people online. So social media and forums is a really powerful way to connect with people over things like Twitter or forums like Reddit. You can also look to creative media, so things like YouTube or Medium, maybe there's a podcast or something like that. You might find employees or, for example, developer evangelists from the companies that you're interested in, and you can follow them and engage with them. Another really interesting strategy is to become a product power user. So if there's a product from a company that you really want to work for, you could become a power user of that product. So you can give them a lot of really good feedback, or see if you can do some user testing. You could find a bug in their product. That can be a really interesting way to engage with the company directly and show them what you're capable of. As you start to reach out to people, it's really important to be mindful of your internet presence, especially right now. When you meet someone, the first thing oftentimes they'll do is Google you. So a little while ago, that might have been a little weird, but now I think that this is pretty much the norm. So you want to make sure that your Google results are exactly what you want. You want to make sure that you have some kind of a portfolio or professional website, whether that is a personal website, maybe a GitHub or LinkedIn page. If you want to show off your applications, it's really great to have them deployed somewhere online so people can see the types of things that you've built. You also might want to highlight your Twitter or your Stack Overflow or any Medium profiles that you have where you're sharing your knowledge. You're building tutorials on YouTube. All of these things are really great to share with your personal, as part of your personal brand. You also want to make sure that your branding is consistent across all of these things. So you want to have usually like the same handle across all of these things if it's your name, if possible like the same profile picture, and that helps people get a better picture of who you are and what you are offering. Also, Google yourself on the regular. You can even set up a Google alert if you want on your name. If you have a really common name, that can be kind of annoying, but just see like what is going on the internet when people look for you. All right, so now we're getting to the hard part. This is the writing part. And what we're going to do is we want to take all of these sort of narrative questions and thoughts about ourselves and inject them into our resume. So in this part, I'm going to try to break down as much as I can the writing process of creating a resume to make it more manageable for you. But let's start with why. What is the point of having a resume at all? First of all, your resume is important for you to tell your story. This is a history of all of your professional achievements, and it's in the reader's context. So I don't want you to think of a resume as just an audit trail for you. It's not just like a long list of everything you've ever done. In fact, it is a marketing document about you for a reader. So it's really important to remember that you think about the role and the person, the company that you're submitting it to. The other part of the resume is to show how you are the best match for the job. So you want to take your experience from your personal history and use it to draw connections between your history and the requirements for this job. It's also important to remember that your resume is not an advertisement for the companies that you've already worked for. It's an advertisement for you. So you don't need to go into a ton of detail about what the company does or what exactly the project was. You want to focus on your accomplishments. You want it to be memorable, punchy, and not boring. So I think a resume needs to be three things. It needs to be readable, succinct, and relevant. So let's go through each of these attributes. Does anyone know what 7 seconds represents? You can put it in the chat. You can guess. How fast they look at your resume. Yeah, you got it. Yeah, so that's how long the recruiter will look at your resume before moving on to the next one. It's pretty terrifying, especially because you spend all this time building the resume and then they don't look at it for very long. So what does this mean? This means the resume has to be readable. You need to make it friendly to the person who's reading it. The number one thing for US resumes is that they should be 1 page. This is very different than in European countries and many other countries where they use a CV, which is multiple pages, often like several. But in the United States, if you have 10 or less years experience in the field, it should be about 1 page. If you're more senior, it could be 2 pages. If you're like a C-level, someone with like 30 years experience, maybe it's a little bit longer. But for the majority of people, you want to keep it to 1 page. Just like when you write an email, you want to keep the important stuff at the top, right? You have 7 seconds of the person's attention, and you need to grab them, right? So whatever is most important needs to be at the top of your resume. You also want to mark your sections of the resume clearly. So that way, the person's eyes will be drawn to the different sections. So you have your experience, you have your contact info, maybe you have a skills section, you have achievements, and your education. You also want to use a professional and modern font. If you send a recruiter a Times New Roman resume in size 8 single-space font, they're not going to read it. Their eyes are going to glaze over and they're going to get a headache. So please try to use a nice, clean, readable font. Also, you want to use consistent formatting and white space. So if you learn a little bit about typography, I actually spent some time reading about it. It's really interesting and helpful. And it allows you to engage so much more with the content if you have good formatting. Also, please save your resume as a PDF. If you send it as another file format, it might not display the same way on the person's computer as you expect. So PDF is your best bet. And put your name in the file name. That way, if the person saves it to their desktop, they will know whose resume it will be when they first see it. So someone's asking, what font do I recommend for resumes? So this is a personal opinion thing, and I actually have a link in the deck at the very end of this that we'll be sending out that goes through this in way more detail because I'm not a designer. I would say I personally think that a nice sans serif font, so something like Helvetica is very classic. There's also more modern-y ones, more Google font equivalent, something like Helvetica or Arial is fine. If you want to go with a serif font, you can. Garamond is very nice. So it kind of depends on your style and what you're going for. But I would recommend against Times New Roman, personally, because whenever I see Times New Roman, I always think there's something wrong. Because when you see Times New Roman in the web browser, you always think like, oh no, someone's style sheets are broken. So I personally hate Times New Roman. Some people like it, especially for more traditional industries like academia or government, but yeah. Someone else is asking, a different workshop said that the programs that read resumes don't read PDF slots. Great question. So I would recommend actually having 2 different versions of your resume. So if you're submitting a resume through an applicant tracking system, you might want to have a resume that's more like of a plain text type of a format so that the different sections don't get all messed up. I still think that you should have a PDF that you send to a person. So if you're connecting with someone at a conference or whatever, you want to send them a nice PDF version. You don't want to send them a plain text version. Someone's asking, what if you have 10 plus years of experience? Are 2 pages okay then? Yeah, if you've been an engineer for more than 10 years, I would say go for it. But just know that the recruiters have very limited time. And everyone's attention span is real short in 2020. So someone's asking, I guess you'll be sharing the slides afterwards? Yes, I will be sharing them. We're also going to make sure we try to get a link to them in the YouTube video that gets posted onto YouTube after this. Someone else is asking, if you have a gap between industry-related jobs, do you include the unrelated jobs you worked in the meantime? That's a great question. I would say if you can fit them and you can come up with a way to make them connect to the job that you're applying for, definitely. If you're feeling like a little need for space, you might have to be a little more conservative. I would say it's better to have an unrelated job than like a big gap if it's like many years. But we're actually going to talk about that a little bit later in the presentation. And finally, if you are feeling overwhelmed by the design process, you can also use a template. So Google Docs has a lot of templates available that are free. Another great site I've been enjoying is Canva. They have like a number of really beautiful designs. Resume.io is another one. It is paid, but they have some really nice resume templates as well. All right, so I'm going to go into some do's and don'ts for resumes. And again, these are pretty specific to resumes in the United States, so you're going to want to check the standards and practices of whatever other country you're applying to if you're outside of the US. First of all, you want to include your contact info. Please don't forget your contact info. You want your email, your phone, your GitHub, or any portfolio links. You want to include the city and the country that you're living in. You want to include your professional experience. So this includes anything that can be construed as professional, whether that is even internships that are paid or unpaid. And you want to make sure that you have dates and locations for your experience. If it's remote, you can mark it as remote. When you list the dates, please include the months. Don't just include the years. If you just include the years, it can be quite misleading. Because I don't know whether you started in January of 2019 or December of 2019, big difference. Also include any higher education that you have, any degrees, boot camps, coursework, whether that's online or in person, especially if it's relevant to the role. Learning has changed a lot, especially even just in the last 5 years. So you should definitely, if you've done like online classes, you can definitely include them as well. You also want to include any relevant tech skills, certifications, awards, anything that could potentially be relevant to the job. And one thing that's really important is if you can't write code in it, don't list it on your resume. Anything you put on your resume is fair game. If you want to show that like you're a beginner at something and a more advanced at something, you could include like your level. So you could include like a degree of proficiency. Or you could, some people have like a little like bar chart or star chart about like their levels of proficiency. That's cool, but do not include something that you couldn't answer questions about in an interview. All right, let's see. What do you suggest for people that are transitioning in their career? So we're going to go into that a little bit. We're going to talk about relevance. I would say generally, if you're transitioning and you don't have tech experience, you probably want to lead with projects or other things that point to your technical proficiency in education. But I'm going to go into that a little bit deeper in a couple of slides. Hasn't country or city or physical address been used to gatekeep jobs though? Yes, I'm actually going to talk about that in the next slide. And then another one related to cities, if you are applying to a job in another country city, should you still put where you currently live on your resume? Yes. You don't want to mislead the company into thinking that you would not need to relocate or you'd be remote. You want to be honest about your physical location. So this is the list of things to maybe include on your resume. And the first bullet actually refers to that person's question, which is, should you include your full home address? So traditionally, people put their full home address on their resume because there was written correspondence happening. That's not happening anymore. So I would recommend generally not, unless it's required. And the reason why is exactly as the poster mentioned, gatekeeping, right? So that can be used to discriminate against you. I think, including your physical location is still probably important. The company is probably going to ask you anyway, but you don't need to necessarily include your full home address unless they need it for a background check or something further down the line. Another thing that is up for debate is whether you should have a summary, statement of intent, or objective. A lot of people do use this as a way of sort of centering their resume and branding it. I would say it depends on where you're at in your career. So I personally like to have like a couple sentence summary. It's usually akin to like what you would put on your LinkedIn or what would be pinned there. But I would say overall, you don't have to include it. Also, if you're just out of college, sometimes it's helpful to include an objective statement. So this kind of explains like where you're at and what you're looking for in your next role. But I would say you don't have to include it. Also, your education details. So this is things like your GPA, your very specific GPA, and the year that you graduated. You do not have to include either of those things on your resume. The guidance that I've heard is that if you have a very good GPA, you can include it. So some people say it's like a 3 out of 4 or 3.5 out of 4, but you don't have to. And a lot of companies are not looking at that anymore. Even Google is starting to not look at that kind of thing anymore for engineering roles. Also, the year of your graduation. So this can be something that could be used against you. If it was a long time ago, this can contribute to ageism. So some people do leave it off their resume. You're not required to put it if you don't feel comfortable. Some people ask, is it better to put your education or your experience first? So the general rule of thumb that I've heard is that you really want to lead with your experience if you have it. So if you have experience in the role, you want to put that at the top. But if you're just out of a boot camp or you're a career transitioner, you might need to put your education first, or maybe your projects or something. So it's kind of whatever you want the person to focus on in terms of your qualifications for the job. All right, the next question, another question we often get is, how do I list projects on my resume? So there's so many different ways you can do this. You can do them as like a little bit of a gallery if you want to include projects on your resume. If you already have a couple different jobs behind you, you might not need to, but for some reason, for some folks, they're looking to add more bulk to their resume, and so they use projects as like a really good way to showcase that. So you can list it out with like a description of the project and the types of technologies that you used. You can even link to them directly. That's really nice. But you don't have to include them if you don't want to. It's kind of a judgment call. Also, people ask about like, how fancy should I get? So if you've worked in other industries, tech resumes are actually a lot less formal than a lot of other spaces. So sometimes you'll see very like beautiful colors and infographics. I would say use your judgment on this. If you're applying to a UX role or any kind of design customer-facing role, maybe you want it to be a little bit more sleek. But if you're like a DBA, you probably don't care about having a very fancy resume. So you want it to reflect what you're capable of. Obviously, if you pay someone to make like a beautiful bespoke custom resume that you can never reproduce in real life, then you might be on the hook for some skills you don't have. I don't know. But I would say overall, that's your judgment. People also ask about volunteer work. So I think volunteer work can be a really great addition to a resume, especially if your resume is a little bit light and you're not sure like what other things to put on it. I would say as much as possible, if it can be relevant to the role or the job or the company that you're applying for, that's going to make it more powerful, but you don't have to include it. And then finally, hobbies, extracurriculars, interests. I think that this can go either way. So obviously, if it's related to the job or the industry, like it's really helpful to include. I think sometimes it can also distract from the kind of flow or the narrative of the resume. So you want to use your kind of own discretion about how much you want to include. I personally don't ever include it because I think like it's not usually necessary. The other thing is if you want to showcase your hobbies, you can also do that on like a personal website, maybe not on your resume. Jackie says, use your 7 seconds wisely. I agree. I agree. Cool. And Nia says, do you include language proficiency for foreigners? Yeah, if you speak multiple languages, you can definitely include that on your resume as skills as well. Another question here, what's a good way to mention that I've had a long time website maintenance client during that time off? That's a great question. So let's say you take some time off, but you're also maintaining a website for someone. List that as first-class professional experience because you're doing work for someone. It's still experience. Definitely listed as a job. What do you suggest for people that are transitioning your career? We'll definitely get to that. Do you have an example resume to show us at all? It'd be great to see all these tips and an example to visualize. I don't have one right now. I can certainly follow up with a few. That's good feedback, though. If we were a software engineer and test, but open to BSA, I'm assuming that's automation kind of roles, how do we convey that? So we're going to go into this, but the main thing that you want to do is you want to take the attributes of your previous roles that you've already done and try to connect them to the attributes of the roles that you're applying for. So we're going to go into that shortly. Pics or no pics on resumes, what do you recommend? This is actually my next slide. Do not include in the United States your picture on your resume. So this is actually a really common thing in a lot of other countries. Outside of the US, people do put their pictures on their resume, but in the US, it's not recommended that you do that because it opens you to discrimination and a whole bunch of other things. So please don't put it on your resume. Also, on that same note, please don't list your date of birth, your age, your gender, or your race on your resume in the United States. Those are all protected classes, and you should not put them on there. You also don't need to include primary or secondary school details. I know that in other countries outside the EU, sometimes people do this. I would say overall, you should definitely skip adding them. Unless if high school is your most recent level of education, then certainly include it. But if you already have post-secondary degree, you don't need to include it. Sometimes people that went to very specialized high schools will sometimes include it, but I would say overall, especially if you're a few years out, you probably don't need to. Also, please don't include skills that are not relevant to the job. So if you are applying for a software engineering position, please don't include Microsoft Word, because that's not part of the job. The more skills that you list on your resume doesn't mean you're a more qualified candidate. The point of listing skills is that you're trying to target the skills that are applicable to the job so that they know that you're a good fit. There's also a question that a person has a university diploma, the specialist degree in computer science and math in Russia. How should I align it in my resume while applying on a position in the US? Unfortunately, I'm not sure. I would definitely try to see if you can look it up. If the degree doesn't translate directly to a BA or a BS, you could say like the number of years that the degree was. That could be really helpful. But yeah, unfortunately, I don't have a super good answer for that. Another thing you should not put on your resume is names of references or people, like other people. If a company wants references, they will ask you for them. You don't need to include them on your resume. And you also don't need to include the phrase references available upon request. Like back in the day, people used to do that all the time. You don't need to do that anymore. And again, standards and practices may differ by country. So please just take a look online. Someone says, if you went to a community college and then transferred to a university, would you recommend putting a community college on your resume? That's a great question. I would say it's definitely a judgment call. My personal opinion is I think that's really cool because that shows, that you were working really hard at a community college and you transferred to a place that you were really excited to attend. But I would say it's a judgment call. I think for some people, they will just put the university where they got their degree. But it kind of depends on your personal story. So with the skills not customized, Michelle asked for, don't include skills not relevant to the job means customize resumes for every job you're applying for. Ideally, yes. And again, it's a gray area, right? It's not black and white. Should you include JavaScript if you're applying for a Python job? Yes. It's more like, don't include, working with, Adobe InDesign if you're applying to be a back-end engineer. I mean, I guess unless it's like a shop where you might potentially be working with Adobe InDesign. The idea is that you want to keep it focused on your skills as a technologist. So as much as possible, try to keep it focused. But it's not, you don't have to create a unique resume for every single possible job, unless you really have the time to do that. I don't. All right. So you might be wondering, I have a lot of stuff I could include on my resume. What if it is too long? So let's talk a little bit about making it succinct. So this is a strategy that I read about a long time ago, and I've been using it for a long time, and it's been really helpful for me. And it's this idea of having a master list. So this is a list of every job, volunteer, intern, whatever, that you have had that could ever possibly be helpful with like very detailed descriptions and keeping that separate from your resume. And the idea is that by having this is the audit trail. This is the audit trail that you do not want to send to employers. But by having this list, you can use it to custom tailor-make resumes for different jobs. So let's say I'm a full stack, mid-level software engineer, and I'm applying to 2 different jobs. I'm applying to a front-end job, and I'm applying to a tech lead job. When I create my resume for the front-end job, what I can do is take the experience from my master list that most directly applies to the front end. So I might take the description from my full stack job and change it a little bit to focus on the front end pieces. I might include something like my web design internship from college, because even though it's design, it's still related to working on the front end of the app. And I might include my volunteer nonprofit website maintenance that I do, even though it might be like not a ton of work, or it might be like managing a WordPress implementation that's not actually relevant to being a React engineer. It's still a front-end experience. The other job I'm applying for is a tech lead job. So this is a more leadership management type of a role. For this job, I might want to tailor that resume to focus on the different leadership attributes of the different jobs that I've worked on. So for example, let's say I had a non-tech job where I was a team lead. I could actually include this on my tech lead job resume, because it shows my leadership skills and my ability to deal with people and manage problems and work through customer problems. I might also want to include if I worked on an open source project where I have like a lot of communication and kind of working with others. All right, we have some other questions in the chat, so I'm going to try to address those. There was a question from the previous slide. Do you need to include information under your education or just the school, major, and dates? I would say it's up to you. I would say if you have a degree, you should certainly list what the degree is in. If you have space and you want to include other pieces about your education, you can. But I don't think it's necessary to include anything other than your school, your major, and your dates. How about projects that I did in university? Should I include it as a job? Great question. You can be a little bit creative with this. So you can either have a project section where you list out all the different projects you worked on. But if you worked on a project with like other people, you could include it as first class professional experience, especially if it was kind of like a long-standing thing, like if it was over the course of several months. You could certainly try to sell it that way. Again, it's marketing. Should I include bootcamp training as educations, since many employers are looking for candidates with degree or look down on bootcamp grads? Yes, so I'm a bootcamp grad, so I feel you on this. I will say that I think that a bootcamp is education, just like any other education. If you have education in another in another subject, like in my example, I put my BA on my degree, on my resume for tech jobs. Like if you have any degree, like put it on there. Doesn't matter whether it's relevant or not, it's important. But I would list the bootcamp. If the employer is not friendly to boot camps, like that's very unfortunate, but it's going to come out anyway. So I would say list it. Should we list tech skills with ratings? If you want, yeah, definitely. People will sometimes list like their proficiency levels. Yeah, if you have like a certification in something, you can certainly do that if you want. Yeah, you don't have to, but some people do. Do you suggest writing a cover letter? We're going to talk about this. What if you minored in computer science? Can you include that, or does it look weird? Yes, please include it, of course. You should definitely add certifications to your resume if you have them, if they're relevant to the tech. If they're not at all relevant to tech, then maybe not. But if you have a Scrum certification or even a project management certification, that's helpful. Any of the certified developers from any of the main companies. Along these lines, what should we do when applying? And there are specific questions about your race, gender, whether you have a disability or whether you're a veteran. I find them on every application in San Francisco. You do not have to answer those questions. So what a lot of companies do have is they want to keep track of the number of, or the type of diversity of the applicant pool. So what they usually do is they have a separate system for like ingesting that information that's not personally tied to you. If you don't feel comfortable answering those questions, you do not have to. But that's why they do it. Should you list tech books read? I've seen that on a few resumes. That's really interesting. I have not seen that. Just my gut instinct is like probably not. I don't know. I think it depends. If you read a book and you made a book club about it, or you wrote an essay on it, or you wrote your dissertation on it, maybe, but I don't know about that. A recruiter asks for a resume that they will use for multiple positions. You send them multiple resumes. Yeah, that's hard. I would say if the positions are widely different, like if you are applying to like a purely back-end role and a purely front-end role, and you have the time, it would be cool to have 2 different resumes. If you can't do it, then you can mesh it all in one. I would say talk to the recruiter, let them know, say like, this is what I want to do. What do you suggest? Ideally, you would be tailoring each resume to the company, but it's not always possible. All right, let's talk about what goes under each job on your resume. You can't just list any old thing on your resume, right? It must be relevant. So this is my personal plea. If you are using any of these terms on your resume, team player, hard worker, self-motivated, communication skills, problem-solving skills, please don't. And I will tell you why. These are all cliches. All of these phrases don't tell me about you at all. Anyone can say they're a hard worker. Anyone can say they have communication skills. You have to show me through the process how you have communication skills. So these are just taking up space. What we're going to go through is how to quantify your experience and make your language more precise so that you can show how you're a good problem solver, how you care about the customer. And we want to quantify as much as you possibly can. So Laszlo Bock, who is a former VP of engineering at Google, wrote this really great article, it's linked at the end of the deck, about the XYZ method. And this is a way of taking the things that you did in your job and turning them into accomplishments or quantifiable successes. So this is the format of the XYZ method. You have your accomplishment, which is X, as measured by Y, by doing Z. So this is a format that you can use to show your accomplishments in a job, and it makes you stand out just a little bit more strongly than just listing out job tasks. And you want to be using interesting and powerful verbs throughout all of it. So X is the accomplishment, Y is how you or the reader knows that you made the accomplishment, and Z is how you actually did the accomplishment. Let's go through some examples. So instead of saying just worked on back end, let's say you're like a Java engineer, what if you say reduce load time on framework that you're using back end by the %. You can actually like include how you increase the load or made the load time better by optimizing queries, and then you can explain how you actually did that. This is way more powerful than saying worked on backend. You can still say worked on backend, but if you try to reframe it as an accomplishment, this shows that you're someone who cares about performance. You're conscientious, and this speaks way more loudly than just listing out your job duties. Here's another one, improved accessibility. How about improved app accessibility to achieve full AAA compliance through conducting a system-wide audit and delivering essential fixes? So this one shows that you understand what AAA compliance means, and it shows that you're conscientious and you're really concerned about this. This is really powerful for a front-end person. Here's another one, fix customer issues. Proactively address customer issues and cut defects by % by implementing a team-wide tech debt initiative. So if something that you did resulted in a number of bugs being cut, like figure out what that was and write on your resume. It's a big deal, right? Quality is really important in software. If you told the rest of your team, like, hey, let's work on tech debt on Fridays, guess what? That is a team-wide tech debt initiative because you said we need to fix these quality issues, and lo and behold, you did. Last one, won a hackathon. Achieve first place in hackathon name out of this number of participants by creating this type of app using these technologies that does this impressive thing. It's so much more exciting to read the second one than the first one, right? And it tells who you are. So this can be really overwhelming to start, but just like when you get stuck when you're programming, you might want to rubber duck it, right? You want to talk to your plant or talk to your cat or talk to your partner or your coworker or your friends and figure out like what are your accomplishments. How can you reframe the things that you do every day to show your strengths? There's a really wonderful blog article here by Julia Evans, who talks about a brag document. And this is keeping a document or a folder on your computer of all the things that you're really proud of. So every time anyone says something nice about you, you can like take a screenshot of it. Or if you have you know, a PR that you're really proud of, like put it in your brag doc. And then when it comes to creating your resume or doing your performance reviews, like it is so helpful. And I've been doing this for years and it helps me so much. Also, there's a really great article linked here about how to quantify things if your job doesn't have easy measures. So oftentimes people will ask, like, what if I don't know like what % I increase cycle time? Or, you know, your best guess is fine. Obviously, don't lie. But if you know that something you did significantly like delivered on something that impacted the business or the customer, like write it on your resume. That's what they want. They're not hiring you just to write code. They're hiring you to deliver something. So show how you did it. All right, to recap the last section, you want your resume to be readable, succinct, and relevant. You want to use action verbs, no cliches, no more problem-solving skills. It doesn't mean anything. You want to quantify your work. You want to use the XYZ strategy to show how you did the things and how you accomplished them and what impact they had. And there's also a great link here from a software engineer at Google that talks in way more depth about how to write a killer software engineering resume. So I definitely recommend. I'm going to pause for a couple more questions. We have about 5 minutes. So I have a CS degree. My previous career was in nursing. Should I include my nursing degree, nursing management experience if I apply for a manager in engineering now? I say yes. I think that's really cool. I think any company will think that's really cool, and it shows that you can work under pressure. It shows that you have an attention to detail. Your nursing education helped you with a lot of things that, even though it seems like they might not relate to software engineering, they definitely do. I'm stuck in a cycle where I want internship to gain experience, but they require previous experience. Oh, I know this. How do I break this deadlock being a recent CS undergraduate? Yeah, it's super tough. I feel for you. I will say, like, whatever projects you can put yourself into. So if you can get involved in open source projects, that would be really cool. If you can get involved in even like help a nonprofit, like if you see a nonprofit that needs help with their website, like help them, or try to get yourself involved in different things that will count as experience, and then be ready to talk about those things. That's going to help you get out of that cycle, but that's a really common thing. What do you recommend putting on your resume if your job title doesn't actually describe your actual role? That's a great question. So I think that's a tough one. I would say there's different schools of thoughts of this. So some people can say you can make your job title more generic than it is. However, the future employer can technically call your previous employer to verify your experience. And if it mismatches, it might not look so good. So what you can do is call out the attributes of the previous role to make them as specific as possible to the role that you're applying for. If the position was like way in the past, like it probably doesn't matter. You can probably just make the title more general, especially if the title makes no sense. You know, I had a job that was like 3 different jobs combined into one, and it was confusing. All right, I have one more slide and we're coming up on time, so I'm going to run through it. Cover letters. So someone asked a question about this earlier. So cover letters are not always required for engineering positions, but if they ask for one, please do it. So follow the instructions. The goal of the cover letter is to show the why behind your application. So, you know, this is just adding additional color to your application or your resume. You want to customize your cover letter to each role and company. So this is really important. Even you can still have like a template, but you want to customize it and like make it applicable to the role and the company. And do not copy a cover letter off the internet. The recruiter will know, and it's really embarrassing and tacky, so please don't do that. Just make a cover letter, make it interesting, make it short. If you're excited about the company, tell them how much you love them. Don't copy paste stuff over the internet. Please also proofread your cover letter. So get someone who's good at writing and can catch all your grammar mistakes. And don't just repeat all the information that's on your resume and your cover letter. All right, we are up on time. A lot of people asking for links, slides and slides. Can I share these during the break? Most certainly I can. And the recording will be on YouTube. For folks that are looking to connect with me, I will post my email in the chat now. And thank you so much all for joining me today. We'll get started on the next session in just 1 minute. All right, part 2. Welcome for anyone that just joined us. Thank you for everyone else who's hanging out and staying on. So we just went through the narrative crafting part of the resume drafting experience. So if you're just joining us, you can watch the previous recording on YouTube. It will be up shortly. In this session, we're going to be talking about the interview. So for those of you just joining us, my name is Shayna Cummings. I'm a software engineer and tech lead at Pluralsight. We're an online tech skills learning platform. I'm also a director for Women Who Code in Boston. So in the first part of our conversation, we talked a little bit about the process of thinking through your personal narrative and creating a written resume and kind of drafting your search. And now you've gotten a call back and you're ready to do an interview. So in the first part of this conversation, we're going to revisit the why. Let's think about your personal narrative and why you're here, why you're looking for a job. Then we're going to have you do research on companies. This is how you get the upper. You really want to dig into the company, do some research. And then finally, the meatiest part of this conversation is going to be how you tell your story during the interview. So we're not going to have time to do a conversation about coding interviews or technical interviews in this session, but there are a number of other really wonderful sessions here today that we'll talk about that. I also encourage you to get hooked up with your local Women Who Code network or online. We do, in Boston, we do interview prep sessions so for coding interviews, so definitely check those out. So in many ways, the process of writing your resume and thinking through your personal narrative has perfectly teed you up for the next phase of your job search, which is actually talking about yourself and to the people that are interested in hiring you. Let's talk about your personal narrative. And again, your personal narrative is your unique story. This is your history that makes you, especially you. And these are some questions you can use to kind of discover that for yourself. So this is recapping a little bit we talked about at the beginning of part 1 of the conversation. So first of all, what experiences brought you here, professional, personal, otherwise? What are the things that you're most proud of? These are the things that you feel a warmth in your heart when you think about them. These are the things that make you get up in the morning. What makes you different? What makes you special? What makes you stand out among your peers, among your team? What gives you energy? What makes you lose track of time? What kind of activities are they? And what aspects of previous jobs did you not enjoy? Like, what do you not want to do again? Like, identify those things. What does your life look like in 2 years, and 5 years, and 10 years? These are all important things. And even though right now is a really complicated and weird time to be thinking about the future, I know for a lot of people, but it is helpful to think ahead. What does your life look like? And not just what role do you want, but like, what does your life look like? I also want you to reconsider your needs. So when you get that interview, of course, you're going to start thinking about, like, how can I fit into this employer's description of what they want for this job? But the reality is this is a two-way conversation. So think about, what is the ideal work? What does your work day look like? What do you want to be doing during the day? What are the types of projects you're working on? What do your colleagues in your team look like? How closely do you want to be working with other people? What about the stability of the company that you work at versus your potential for growth? This is a really important thing to think about. And what about your work-life balance? What are your needs right now in terms of work-life balance? Do you have lots of time to work at a crazy startup in the hopes that you'll build the next best cool thing? Or are you taking care of your family? Or do you need time off to deal with a medical issue? There's so many different needs that you might have. So think about those for yourself. What about the do not want list? This is a list of things you absolutely do not want. You do not want to work on. And then finally, what are your requirements for your salary and your benefits? Again, at the end of the day, you're taking a job so you can make money to provide for yourself and your loved ones. So you need to think about, what do you need to live the life that you want? And this also includes things like education, your healthcare benefits if you have them, any kind of vacation allotment or other support that you get from your employer. One of the best pieces of advice that I ever got was, before you go into the interview, you need to know your walk-away number. What is your walk-away number? This is the absolute minimum amount of money that you will accept for the job. And the reason why you want to identify this before you go into the interview is because if you are getting an interview, there's a chance you might be getting an offer. And if you get an offer, you might just accept it on the spot without thinking really carefully about what it is. So if you know this number ahead of time, this is going to help you shape any conversations that prop up. Another really important thing about your walkaway number is that it might also vary depending on the job. So if there's a job that you really, really want, and maybe it's like a little startup and they don't have a lot of problems, they don't have a lot of resources, they might not be able to offer you as much as like working at Netflix. So it's really important to set that number for each company, but have that number. So the next thing you need to do is do your research. What this allows you to do is get the upper hand in the conversation. And it seems, because it is, this is your opportunity to be a sleuth. This is your opportunity to do all the digging that you want to do about this company. So you want to learn everything that you can about the interview process. This will help you minimize the unknowns, so you'll be more relaxed the day of. Oftentimes, the recruiter will tell you, but you can also look online, different places like Glassdoor, Blind, lots of different community Slacks and forums. People will actually share with you what they went through during the interview, and this will help you be more prepared. You also want to find out who will be interviewing you. So you can check out their LinkedIns, their GitHubs, their social media. A power move would be like, if you, saw this person speak at a conference about a topic, you could bring it up. So just understand who your interviewers are, where they're coming from. Yeah, Alyssa says internet stalk them. Yeah, you can stalk them, don't be too creepy, but yeah, just figure out who they are, because it's going to help you have the most substantial conversation with them, and it's going to help you get on their level. Also, figure out, what does their company do? What is their product? What is their business? You might be applying for a coding job, but at the end of the day, you're writing code for a reason, right? I can't tell you the number of software engineers that I've met in interviews that have no idea about the company. And it's like, you just got to figure out like the very bare minimum about, why are they paying you? It just sets you apart, especially as an engineering candidate. Likewise, who are their users? Who are their stakeholders? If you're a software engineer that can speak eloquently about the competitors. Like, that's really cool. That's going to set you apart from a lot of other candidates. So just do a little bit of research. You can also use things like Crunchbase to figure out like the financials. If it's a public company, you can see all of the financials. So yeah, just check it out. Also look at the company culture and values. This is really important in a lot of companies. Every company has usually some kind of a page. It's like about us, values, or culture. So figure out what those things are and be able to talk about them. That's going to make you a way more exciting candidate if you can already speak their language. Also, it's really important to get familiar with the tech stack. Now, hopefully you'll already have a sense of what the tech stack is. If there's going to be a coding interview, they should tell you what language you'll be coding in. And if they don't tell you, you should ask. It's also not that you have to know everything about the tech stack. You definitely don't. But if you can speak to even specific frameworks or testing methodologies or other things that are going to be relevant to the job, that's going to make you such a more exciting candidate for them. You also want to know who else is in this role. What are their backgrounds? This is a perfect LinkedIn stalking opportunity. Everyone does it. But seriously, like, what is needed for this specific role, and like who succeeds in this role, as much as you can find out, is going to really help you frame yourself in the interview. You also want to find out the compensation for this role. So lots of websites allow people to share their salary. They're not always accurate, so you should always take it with a grain of salt. But you should definitely consider looking into compensation for the role so you have a sense of whether what they're going to offer you is good or not. All right. This is the part where you get to tell your story. When you're going into the interview, you want to put your best foot forward. So here are some general tips for how you want to approach the interview. First of all, you want to be friendly and try to relax as much as you can. Obviously, telling someone who's nervous to relax is not effective, and I realize that, but try to do some deep breathing exercises, make sure you do lots of practice, try to be as relaxed as possible because you want to show who you truly are. If you put on airs in an interview, you're not showing your real self, and it's going to be much harder to connect with people. So as much as possible, know that you got this far, know that clearly they want you because they invited you to the interview. So, be confident and be ready to talk about who you are. I think for a lot of women, it can be hard to come across as confident. I think oftentimes women are not socialized to talk about their accomplishments. The other extreme of that is being a real, arrogant person who's cutting people off or posturing. But I think, it's important to find that balance of, showing your humility and your knowledge of your own weaknesses, but also being confident and really proud of the things that you've done. Also recommend, your appearance matters as much as possible, to have a professional appearance and demeanor. Make sure that you have a good video background if you're going to be doing a Zoom interview. Obviously, your body language, your eye contact, your tone of voice, your facial expressions, all those things matter so much more when you're on camera. And you also have to remember that most people are not experienced at doing video interviews. For a lot of places, especially right now, they've never done them before. So there's going to be a little bit of a learning curve there, and that's okay. You don't have to be perfect, but just know that it does matter more when you have someone on camera than generally when you're in a room. You also, if you're doing an in-person interview, you want to show up a little bit early. Please don't show up like 20 minutes early. That is way too early, and people are always like frustrated and confused. I think 10 minutes is great. Showing up a little bit early shows that you're on the ball, but you're not actually like intervening kind of in the day-to-day of the business. In your interview, you want to show passion for the company and the problem space as much as you can. Now, if you're not normally like a very extroverted or excitable person, this can be really challenging. And you don't have to fake it. But what I would encourage you to do is to think about the parts of the job that you're excited about, if there are things that you're excited about or things you're interested in, and try to laser focus on those things to show your enthusiasm for the job. Also, please listen to the interviewers. It can be really frustrating as an interviewer if you spend like a really long time explaining something and the person doesn't listen and then they ask a question about it immediately after. It's really obvious. So, try to be mindful of the fact that the interviewers are taking the time to talk with you. Obviously, you're spending way more time than they are, but try to be really thoughtful of their time and attention as you go through the process. And finally, please send a thank you email. I think it's a really classy thing. It's not always done, but I think it's a really nice thing to do, especially to the recruiter. But if you get the hiring manager's email, if someone gives you a business card, you can email them, and it doesn't have to be long. It can just be, thank you so much for your time. And if you connected on a particular topic, you can, kind of talk about that. But just a couple sentences is really nice. One thing I will say is please do not try to connect with the interviewers on LinkedIn before you get the job, because it's really awkward for the interviewers if you don't get the job. Just don't put them in that position. So there's some questions in the chat here. Would you recommend invoicing people on the role on LinkedIn for more understanding of the role? I would recommend not doing that. If you get the opportunity to meet that person in another context, I would say yes. But I think most people get very overwhelmed by the amount of contact that they get on LinkedIn. And especially if it's cold email, it can be really hard. So I would say try to get a connection with those people in a different way. Like if you're in the same meetup community, or if you work on the same project, or you're in a community Slack channel. But cold emails on LinkedIn is not always effective. What if you're a senior position in another state? How do you set yourself apart? Yeah, so if you're looking for a role that's elsewhere from where you live, and you're going to be needing like relocation assistance, or you're going to be a remote person, I think it's important to be transparent about that. But I would say, like in general, you want to lead with your skills, right? Your physical location at the end of the day, it shouldn't really matter. You want to lead with your skills and your efficacy at doing the role. On thank yous after interviews, they're tricky to do when operating through a third-party recruiter. I usually don't get to contact the interviewers ever again. Yeah, that's a great point. If you're working with a third-party recruiter, sometimes you don't actually get to connect with the interviewer. You can ask the third-party recruiter for the person's email address. If you went to an in-person interview with the person and you really want to thank them, like I think it's completely acceptable to, try sending them an email. Oftentimes people's emails are just like, first name dot last name at company.com. Obviously don't be annoying about it. Don't spam them. But if possible, I think sending a thank you email is a really nice thing to do. And I personally have never felt like it's rude to send it. Like I think it's a nice thing to do as long as it's genuine and not like you're spamming them. All right. So let's talk a little bit how your personal narrative gets worked into this interview process. So they're going to ask you, like, tell me about yourself. And now this is the time that you want to let it shine. You want to show how you learn and how you skill up. As a technologist, you're never going to learn everything that you need to know and be done, right? As engineers, we are learning every single day. And even if you have a computer science degree, that is only going to take you so far, right? You're going to be learning all of the time. So you want to be able to show how you do that on the job at work. You also want to show how you've faced challenges and succeeded. So you want to be able to talk really eloquently about the different challenges that were facing you or your company and use those in your narrative and show how you used your skills to overcome those challenges. You also want to be able to talk to the different experiences that have brought you to where you are right now. Sitting in front of this potential employer, interviewing for this potential role, try to think about how those things relate directly to what this employer wants, which is to hire the best person for this job. And you want to think about what strengths will you add to this team. So generally, employers do not want carbon copies of the people they already have, right? Usually if they're hiring, it means they want to add someone with additional skills to the team. So think about your skills in the context of the team, so much that you know about the team and what you can add. And if you have experience outside of tech, because sometimes this is really powerful. If you have worked in, for example, education or customer service, those are actually skills that are really transferable to working on an engineering team. So think about the ways that you can take those skills and map them to what's being asked of you in the role. How do you manage your time, communicate, and prioritize? So these are things that we don't tend to emphasize so much as software engineers. We tend to focus on like hard skills, but these are really important skills as an employee that it's important for you to be able to speak to. So I would definitely recommend thinking about the ways that you do these things and being able to speak really well about them during the interview. In all of these, you want to have specific personal examples for all of these things. You want to have stories from your previous roles, from your previous experiences that help you answer these questions. So I'm going to take a look at a couple questions here. Should we send a thank you note right after the interview, or should we wait a couple days? I would say like it's kind of your judgment call. I would say within 24 hours is generally a bet. If you're really excited, you can send it like an hour, 2 hours later. Maybe if you send it like right away, that might be like too much, but yeah, use your judgment. What is your suggestion for phone interviews in terms of maybe in terms of thanking people? I would say, yeah, if you don't have the person's contact info, then yeah, maybe you can't contact them. That's okay. You can also do something like you can send, if you have the recruiter's email, you can send them, say like, please extend my thanks to the team. I really enjoyed talking to so-and-so, blah, blah, blah. You can make it a little more custom and ask them to pass along the message. Is it okay to send an email to a hiring manager and address the question you thought you did not do well on in the interview? Is that recommended? I would say no. I would say generally the hiring manager is probably really busy. And if you want, depending on what the circumstance is, you could try to talk to the recruiter, but I would say overall, I would not recommend, you can thank the hiring manager if you have their email, but I wouldn't like send them a bunch of messages about the interview. If you're transitioning to different careers, should we be drawing parallels to our previous career? Yes, I would say whatever experience you had in your previous career that is applicable to the role that you're applying for, you should try to incorporate it. So let's say you're applying for a engineering management position and you were previously a manager in like a bio lab or something. Management is a transferable skill. That's something that you can do in any industry and any role. So what you want to do is focus less on the bio part and more in the manager role, right? And you can draw parallels between jobs in many different ways. What do you suggest we do when it seems that the recruiter is attacking you or maybe trying to make you fail? Yeah, unfortunately, some companies have really bad practices around interviewing. It's a personal pet peeve of mine when companies are not sending out their best people to interview. They should be sending out people who are trained and experienced at interviewing, and sometimes you just get a person who's a jerk. So I think as much as possible, you want to take the high road, right? You want to show them how, undefeatable you are, and just be like overwhelmingly polite, like kill them with kindness if you can. But yeah, sometimes you're gonna have someone in an interview who doesn't want to be there or doesn't like you, or maybe they're sexist or maybe they're racist, and unfortunately that happens. And you just have to lead with your best foot forward as much as you can. But also, if there are red flags there, like don't ignore them. You don't want to be working for a company with jerks. I don't. I assume you don't either. So please, pay attention. Cool. All right, let's keep going. So let's talk about honesty. So one of the things you will probably be asked in an interview is about your weaknesses. Everyone has weaknesses. If you say that you don't have weaknesses, that shows that you are not a self-aware person. So what you want to use the weaknesses question for is an opportunity to show how self-aware you are and how you have a growth mindset. So how you are working on them. And please don't say my weakness is that sometimes I work too hard or I'm too diligent, because they know. So what you want to do is you want to take an actual weakness, you want to take something that you are actually working on and show how you're working on it. So like, let's say you struggle with like time management or prioritization. You can say that, you found that you were losing track of time. So you implemented a system with a time tracking app, and now you found that you are whatever % more productive. So you basically take something that's a negative and you turn it into a positive, and you show that you're proactive and you're always learning and you're iterating on how you're doing. Another thing that's important to note is if you have gaps or inconsistencies in your work history, be ready to talk about those. Those are not necessarily negative things. Lots of people, might have gaps for they took time to take care of a family member, or they might have had a visa issue and they weren't able to work during that time. That's totally okay. Just be ready to talk about those things. And I think the tide has turned a little bit in a lot of these tech companies. People are becoming more aware that, like, yeah, sometimes you have to have a family. So just, try to be ready to talk about them. Another thing you can do if you have a gap in your resume is talk about the other activities you did on the side that maybe weren't work during that time. So like maybe you were in a book club or a technical book club, or maybe you were working on an open source project or helping someone with their personal website. There's all kinds of things that you might have done during that time still valuable to the job, so you can talk about those things. And in all cases, you want to have specific experience examples. So what are some other red flags you should watch out in interviews? It's a great question. So, if you're a woman or you're a person of color, you probably already know when there's an issue, right? You already know about maybe microaggressions. If someone is not looking you in the eye, I mean, sometimes that's just how it goes. But, there's other situations where, if someone's very unprofessional, you can kind of tell, like, maybe there's a problem here. I would say just use your gut sense. Use the same, your same like spidey sense that you have to evaluate anyone in that interview. Would it look bad to the interviewer if you say your weakness is lacking confidence about your knowledge? No, I think that's a very fair weakness. You can say, like, I've struggled with self-confidence, or maybe don't use the word struggle, but you can say, like, something I'm working on is my own self-confidence. And you can talk about how are you working on that? Like, are you giving talks? Are you seeing, are you doing some coaching? Like, there's so many other things you can do to talk about how you're tackling confidence, because tackling confidence is actually a really important part of you getting to, your senior level engineer role. All right, we're coming up on time here, so I'm going to keep going. We have some common questions here. I'm not going to go through all of them, but you can get these at the end. We'll post a link in the chat to the slides. But these are really common questions that you should be ready and comfortable to answer. And you want to have specific examples for all of these as much as you can. So just practice them. Don't memorize them. If you memorize them, it will come off as very canned. But if you have like a friend or a coworker or a partner that you can practice them with, it will help you a lot. Here are some don'ts. This first one is my personal opinion, but I don't believe you should ever introduce yourself as junior. So this is why. If you use the word junior, what you're doing is you're inviting someone else to make a whole bunch of assumptions about your maturity, about your experience, about your capacity for learning potentially, about what they should pay you. Let the interviewers decide whether or not you're junior. Just lead with your experience. If you have the word junior in your title on your resume, that's okay, but don't introduce yourself as junior. Someone gave this piece of advice to me a long time ago, and it's like one of my favorite pieces of advice. So another thing I would recommend is please don't say that you're nervous during the interview. So this is like the most natural instinct in the world when you're nervous. But what you're doing is you're actually taking the focus in the room from your nervousness and putting it, like from the conversation, putting it on your nervousness. And then that makes you more nervous. So try not to say that you're nervous, and you'll start to relax as you go. Also, a really important negotiation tactic is to not show your hand regarding money. So as much as possible, you want them to throw out the first number, and I will tell you why. So let's say you're prepared to ask for $90,000, but they're prepared to give you $100,000. If you ask for $90,000, you've just cheated yourself out of $10,000, and that might take you several years to make up. So as much as possible, and this is, there's a million workshops on this, there's some workshops on this today, try not to throw out the first number when you're talking about salary. Try to be a little coy and just say, like, you know, I want something that's commensurate with my experience. And yeah, try to push that conversation to the end as much as you can. Please don't talk poorly about past employers. Yeah, someone asked, how do you avoid being too negative if you're not having good experience at your current employer? First of all, I feel you. Lots of people experience bad employment situations, burnout, harassment, just terrible things in tech. Tech has a lot of problems. And if you are a member of an underrepresented or marginalized group, you are probably feeling those problems tenfold. So first of all, I acknowledge that. However, you don't want to bring them up in the interview for a couple different reasons. First of all, it changes the entire tone of the conversation. It turns it into a positive focus on what you can bring to the company, and it turns it into a much more negative conversation. You don't want to do that. What you can do is you can say, like, you know, maybe there are specific challenges that you're having, but you don't want to make them personal. So you don't want to talk about a bad manager or a bad business decision. You can talk about them very generally, and then you can pivot the conversation to saying, this is what I'm looking for in my next role. And I think that that's totally acceptable. But the thing is important to remember is if you trash talk people, it's just bad karma. You don't want to do it. The world is small. You don't know who knows who. So as much as possible, try to keep it positive, try to keep it focused on your skills and what you're bringing to the conversation. Also, please don't use too much jargon in your interview. Sometimes people use jargon because it thinks it makes them sound smarter. You want to use the terms that are appropriate to the conversation, but you don't want to just like throw a bunch of mumbo jumbo at them, because it's really obvious when you do that. Especially if you don't feel comfortable with the words, try not to use terms that you're not totally comfortable with. And please don't ever lie or misrepresent yourself or your experience. It will come back to you. Karma is real. And don't be late or unprepared. Obviously, things happen. Your internet stops working, the train breaks down. That's totally acceptable. It happens all the time. But as much as possible, try to put your best foot forward. All right, we got 4 minutes left, so I'm going to go real quick. I wanted to let you know that in the United States, it's actually illegal for interviewers to ask you about these protected categories. These are all from the US Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and these are all things that could be used to potentially discriminate against you as a candidate. So you should not be asked about these things during the interview. If you are asked about them specifically, you should just say, like, I don't feel comfortable answering that, but I super hope you don't get asked about them. It is legal to ask questions that are relevant to the job. So they're allowed to ask you, you know, are you fluent in English? Are you legally eligible to work in the United States? They're allowed to ask you things like that, but they're not allowed to ask you questions about your religion or your family status or anything like that. A really important call out here is salary history is actually, they can't actually ask you about it in several states in the US, which is really cool. So in California, Massachusetts, Illinois, and New York, and a few other states, they can't ask you what your current salary is, which is really cool, because what that means is you can ask them for the amount of money that you want. You don't get tied to your existing salary, especially if you're being underpaid right now. Really important thing to remember is that interviewing is a two-way street, so you want to use this opportunity to ask them some really good questions. You want to show that you did your research and you're thinking ahead. You want to have meaty questions, so things like, you know, ask them specific questions about their culture and values, what success looks like in this role for the company. 3 months in, what do they expect you to be delivering? And what are some of the biggest challenges ahead that this company and that this team is facing? A couple more things to think about as you go through questions. Think about, can you see yourself there? You might be the only woman in the interview process. You might be the only person of color in the interview process. You might be the only non-binary person in the interview process. There's so many things that might make you feel only or othered in the situation, and that's really unfortunate, and it's a systemic problem. However, do you think that you could trust yourself, that you could trust this team, that you could feel a sense of belonging here? What do you think the team dynamics will be? Will they welcome you? Do the interviewers seem happy? If they're nice, but they're not happy, that's a red flag. They should be selling you on this job. What's the career trajectory for this role? What resources are available to you? What are the biggest risks of this role, taking this role for this company? Some closing thoughts, 1 minute left. Remember that women have always been programmers. From the very first programmer, Ada Lovelace, to Katherine Johnson and Margaret Hamilton at NASA in the 60s, to Tracy Chow today. There have always been women programmers. There are many ahead of you and many behind you. So please just remember, you belong in this space. Be nice to yourself. There's a lot of toxicity out there. Be nice. Discrimination and bias are real. Take time for yourself. Remember that things aren't forever. So no matter what, most jobs you can leave. If it doesn't work out, you can find a new one. Trust your gut. If it's too good to be true, it probably is. Use your red flag sense. And finally, remember that failure is the only way we can really improve. Our industry is constantly evolving. It can be really hard to keep up, but failure is normal and it affects everyone. So be kind to yourself. Good luck. I will be around if you guys want to message me in the chat, and I can share my slides and also my email if you want to connect with me on LinkedIn. So thank you so much. Also Twitter, you can connect with me on Twitter. Thank you.